Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 43 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin, that is Mike, and both of us are very frustrated right now.
Oh, you have no friggin' idea.
Yeah, a little fourth Wally
So here's
stuff,
what
but
happened. So we there was a bunch of other stuff that happened that we could talk about, but the real we became a podcast today, I'd have to say. Because every podcast has a story about how they recorded like half an episode before they realized they weren't recording.
Yep.
Here's the problem. We were recording.
Oh, we
However,
sure were.
both of our internet connections right now are both a little fluky. And
Right.
so it just crapped out on us midway through. Nothing got saved. So here's what's gonna
Here we
happen,
are.
dear listener. We love y'all dearly. We're hoping you appreciate the banter and the calendar and everything we have at the beginning. We're not doing that again. Sorry.
No, we are
It's
not.
just not gonna happen. So we're
You
gonna
can only
get into the
produce
episode today.
produce magic just once.
I don't know what we're producing today, but we're gonna put on an episode for you guys. It's gonna be fun. We just want to give you a heads up that if we sound a little frustrated or if Gavin is like feigning not knowing what is going on, it's because he is faking it.
Yeah, we got about halfway through the episode, maybe a little more than halfway, honestly, and then something wonky happened with the browser service that we use to record and download the recording. So so up until a certain point, I will know what's about to happen. Hopefully, you can not tell the difference. Fourth wall is pretty shattered, but that's okay.
We're gonna be honest with you. That's what's gonna happen. So Gavin's got a lot going on, as do I. However, Gavin has more going on, and so this is going to be a Mike takes the wheel episode. For those
It sure is.
that don't know, any new listeners that we might have, I'm a social studies teacher. I teach history, and when we talk about this, the name of our podcast is "I Wish You Were Dead," and normally that refers to paleontology and biology, as Gavin's, you built this whole podcast around. But on the episodes that I get to take the wheel, we're going to look at either a person or an event or something from history, like human history, to kind of focus on and shed a light on. And I don't want to do like George Washington or Abe, like the people you already know about. So far,
Exactly.
the 3 episodes I've already done, and I think this episode as well today, we're going to be learning about some new people that deserves to have their stories at least heard, and hopefully remembered. And so with that, I'll begin here, and I will ask Gavin this question again, as we did during our first attempt. But Gavin, uh, what do you know about the Civil War? I guess I'll just phrase it that way. The American Civil War. What do you know about it?
Well, I know that it was between the what is currently today the northeastern United States and the southeastern United States, going into the Midwest a bit, I guess, depending on how you define that. As someone who lived in like technically the Midwest for a couple years, that gets really touchy, actually. What you actually call mid, yeah, because it's like I would kind of call South Dakota Midwest. A lot of people in South Dakota would not. It's a whole thing. But anyway, so the Northeast and the Southeast, and I believe it started in 1863.
61, but you got the right idea.
Okay, so early-ish, well, I guess actually early 1860s, and more or less the southeastern states, who had a lot more of like farmland and like larger plantations and such, just really wanted to own black people, and the North wanted to pass laws being like, "Hey, that's bad." Whether or not they actually believed black people should have rights or not, that's a different conversation. I think they kind of just wanted to pull one over on the South, if I'm being honest. But the South just really wanted to own people, and the North was like, "Hey, maybe don't." And the South were like, "No, I still want to." And then they were like, "We're going to be our own country where you can own black people forever." And that's more or less how it went, at least at the beginning, from my understanding.
Yeah, I mean that covers a lot of it. As has been said 1,000 times, there are 1,000 secondary reasons why the Civil War happened. But the Civil War was about slavery and about these southern United States wanting to continue their ownership of Black people. So we were starting there with the Civil War, um, and just kind of with that context surrounding it. Now, are you familiar with any of the people that were the any of the people of the Civil War? I want to leave that really broadly. Like, are there any names from the Civil War? It's a really important event in American history. Who surrounding that Civil War are you familiar with?
Let's see. So the obvious one is Abraham Lincoln. And
Correct, President of the United States.
the only other people that like really come to mind readily are some of the Confederate people, like the
Confederate were the side fighting for slavery against the rest
yes,
of the Union. Yes.
yeah.
So who you got?
So let's see. Stonewall Jackson, who was a Confederate
Great name.
general. Right,
Racist.
great name, bad person.
Religious racist, but yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense, but okay.
Yeah,
Like I
yeah.
don't know if you actually understand how the Bible works, being racist is not a thing. But yet here we are in the year of our Lord
One thing we're not going to be
2021.
doing is breaking out the Bible on this podcast.
No, we will not. Uh, but yeah, Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, who was another Confederate general. And
Yeah,
pretty much the only
the
reason
lead
that I
general for the
know,
Confederates.
yeah, pretty much the only reason that I know them is because of how they get brought up every so often, especially in like these days with like talk about statues and things being replaced and such. It's usually of people like that. We're not usually talking about replacing statues of like the Union generals, but I would also wager that there
Right,
are
and so
probably far fewer uh, statues to the Union generals, to be honest.
yeah, I mean that sort of goes with the lost cause mythology of the South that began to
Hmm.
take hold roughly in the 1880s or so, is my understanding, is when that starts to take a firm grasp, and that's something that I plan on reading a few books on in the coming years. My problem is that I'm a very weak and slow reader, but we'll say we can get there another time. But some other just more famous people that people might be familiar with. Probably the least famous person out of the couple I want to mention up top here is the president of the Confederacy. Would you have any? If I gave you 1,000 guesses, would you be able to get that?
Eventually, yes. Um, because I can picture. Oh no, I'm thinking of the Confederate vice president. Um, because I can picture
Okay.
his face because I know he gave. It's called the Cornerstone speech, more or less. That's a very famous speech that he gave, basically laying out that like, hey, we're definitely all about the slaves here. Even though you might have heard at some point in your high school education that it was about states' rights. Um, like the South was more pro states' rights, but they just wanted to own black people. That's why they had the war. Um, but uh, once you say his name, I'm going to recognize it, but off the top of my head, no, I don't know what his name is.
Yeah. So the Abraham Lincoln's counterpart in the Confederacy, the
Hmm.
president of the Confederacy, was a man named Jefferson Davis.
That's right.
Um, you were thinking of the Vice President Alexander Stevens, who
Yes.
yeah, who gives when people are sort of trying to retort to the Civil War is about states' rights, and people are trying to shoot that down. His speech, along with like the Constitution of South Carolina and just the general conduct of the South, are generally brought up to shoot that down. Um, so that was Lincoln's counterpart, and then you mentioned a couple of generals for the Confederates: Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee,
Hmm.
and a couple of the more famous generals from the Union side are William Tecumseh Sherman, known
Okay.
for blazing through Georgia quite literally. Um, and if you've ever seen a $50 bill, a wonderfully handsome alcoholic named Ulysses S. Grant.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I've not seen that many $50 bills in my life. I was a grad student until recently. So
Well, I assure you, they're worth it. You should try them out someday. So those are some of the
uh,
famous people of a war, and the reason I wanted to bring all of them up, none of these people are the subject of what we're going to be talking about today, or who we're going to be talking about today.
mhm.
Um, I have to confess, even though I'm a social studies teacher, I'm not a military history guy. It doesn't really interest me. Troop movements and battle strategies and everything else. It's just not my thing. That having been said, one thing I've found as I've gotten more into history, kind of through college and then now teaching it, is that whether it be a war or anything else, if you look deep enough, and you don't have to look that deep if you know where to find things, there's a lot of great stories that are not widely known that people don't remember. Or they might remember like, oh yeah, like I think I learned that once, however long ago, but I wouldn't
Hmm.
have recalled it unless somebody didn't remind me. There's always those stories somewhere. And so what I've always wanted to do with my Mike Takes the Wheel episodes is just kind of highlight some people whose stories don't get told all that often, but are still really interesting parts of this. And I think I did that the first three episodes, and I'm hoping that today I'll be
Yeah,
able to do it
totally.
again. So we're going to begin today with our story is about a guy named Robert Smalls, who was born in South Carolina in 1839. Does that name ring a bell to you at all?
It does very vaguely, only because an episode of Last Week Tonight, one of my favorite television programs, um, talked about him very briefly while actually talking about Confederate statues. Actually, um, he was somebody who was suggested to like replace statues of Confederate soldiers uh, for
Okay, so do you
reasons that
remember
we'll
why
probably
he
address
was?
today.
Yeah, that is correct. Do you remember why? Not that we want to
I
spoil it, but
Right. I think so, but yeah, I
okay.
don't want to spoil it. Only 11 or so minutes in.
Well, we will get to that story now. So we're talking about a man named Robert Smalls, and if you're not familiar with Robert Smalls, don't worry, you're not alone. He was born, like I said, in 1839 in South Carolina, and Robert Smalls was born a slave. He was, again, born in South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union, and has long been sort of the intellectual hotbed of the Civil War. So this is
If there
well enough to
was
date.
such a thing,
Such a thing of what?
an intellectual hub of Confederates. I feel like that's a little bit of an oxymoron.
I understand what you mean by that, but like
Yes,
John
yeah,
C. Calhoun
I'm
had
cracking
been
a joke. Yeah.
no, I 100% know what you mean, but like John C. Calhoun, when you start tracing this former vice president, senator, secretary of state,
Hmm.
member of the House of Representatives, basically had his own political party in South Carolina called the Nullifiers,
Oh,
going back to the
interesting.
1830s, I believe. Yeah, because they believed that it was entirely permissible for a state um, to nullify federal laws if they thought they were unconstitutional or they didn't want to follow them. That has since gone far by the wayside.
Interesting.
Yes, but
Yeah.
yeah, so that's yeah, yeah, right. So when people say the Civil War was about states' rights again, no, but there's a larger conversation to be had in good faith about again those roots of the Civil War. Not the point of what we're talking about today, but just
Right.
understand that while this isn't today considered the Deep South, South Carolina was as strong pro-slavery as you were going to find.
Hmm.
And so what ends up happening, so Robert Smalls is born, he is born a slave. And as he was growing up as a child, his owner seemed to like and favor him and gave him jobs to do in the house. And his mother, Robert Smalls' mother, also a slave, a black woman, a slave, asked for when Smalls became old enough for him to make sure that he worked in the field and he witnessed punishments of slaves as he grew up. Um, and it's a little bit unclear to me exactly why this is, but the best as I can tell is that Smalls' mother was just somebody who was she had been a slave her whole life, and she kind of knew what the ball game was. She knew that she was going to be a slave for most of her life. Her kids were probably going to be slaves for most of their lives, and it would be much better for this young strong man, boy at this time would eventually become a man, to see the system and be prepared at a young age instead of having that sprung on him later on. That's
Okay.
my best guess
Hmm.
as to why she asked for him to see that. Um, and that happened. He started working out in the field, and then eventually, as he grew into being a teenager, it turned out he had a lot of skill working on shipping docks and working with boats. And so he wound up
Interesting.
having, yeah, he wound up
Yeah,
having a
that's
number of
that's
different jobs.
that's not typically what you think of when you think of, like slavery. You usually think of people working in the fields on plantations and things. Or I
Absolutely.
guess
And
I
that's part of what we
I
tell.
hate saying working, I being forced to work. Um,
I'm trying to watch my language with this, and I'm fully aware I'm going to slip up. In fact, I may tell a story at the end of this about something that happened one time that is a delightful story to tell in one of my classes. Um, but I for full disclosure, I suppose I should have said this at the beginning. Both Gavin and I are going to try and watch our language when it comes to the discussion of slaves and working and jobs and everything. Slaves
mhm.
were forced to do jobs against their will, and to suggest anything otherwise is wrong.
Yeah,
So you're right. Even if in the case of Robert Smalls, clearly had a talent for boating and sailing, and he may have done that on his own. He was still a slave, and did so in bondage. So
right.
acknowledge that now, and up front, and you know eh, forgive us for any mistakes in language that we make. Though we're going to try and be careful. When I say we, I mean mostly me. Um, but so Smalls had a he sort of rose the ranks through his teenage years, working in um, working in the shipping yard. He had a lot of different jobs, and eventually worked his way up to sailing the ship. Now, normally that's called, when you're actually the person behind the wheel, that's called a helmsman. However,
Okay.
slaves were not able to actually earn that title. So he was called, I forget the term, but it was something else. But functionally, he could, I was going to say drive. He could sail these boats, and rather large boats, on his own. He was, again, had quite a lot of skill for this.
So this is a very tangentially related question.
Yes.
What? Okay, if the helmsman's the one that is behind the wheel, what does the captain do? I thought that was the captain.
While I could have a guess, I am ignorant of the exact titles and roles on ships,
Okay.
particularly 1850s into 60s roles. So rather than say something that's incorrect, I will plead ignorance,
Okay.
and
That was
and go
just
from there.
it was messing with me a little bit because I really expected the word captain to come out of your mouth and not helmsman. Uh, but anyway,
we,
carrying on.
we will actually get to captain in a hot second.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah. So, or sort of. But we'll get there. So that happens, and then when Smalls is 22, the Civil War breaks out in 1861, like we mentioned,
Hmm.
and you mentioned before how it's you don't normally think of slaves as working on ships. You think of them working in the field. That's part of why slavery didn't develop as strongly in the northern states and was eventually abolished decades before. Was just
Right.
like there was a lot of shipping in the north, and that's just not
Hmm.
really a job suited for people in bondage um, to work, and we will we will see that as we go through this. As the Civil War breaks out, Smalls he was supposed to steer a ship called the CSS Planter, again for the Confederacy. He is a slave steering a ship working for the Confederacy.
So was this
And
a just like a cargo ship? This wasn't like any kind of military ship, was it?
no, this was a military ship. There was guns on board. There was they had plans. There was a captain's code book on board the ship. This was a Confederate
Okay.
ship.
So I see where this is going,
Is
and
this where
I'm
you thought this was
really.
going?
This is exactly where I thought this was going. As soon as you start
Yes.
talking
Okay.
about boats, and then I was like, okay, I'm seeing this coming. How did they not see this coming? Anyway.
This is my question too. Yes. So if you're the listener, you may see this coming, um, as well. But so his job was, and where did I have his job was to kind of survey waterways to find out where some mines were that the Confederates had planted, and to deliver dispatches to troops and everything else. And he started doing this in the fall of 1861. So the war had been going on for six-ish months at that point. And so he had a lot of skill at this, and he had started to earn the trust of the people that were working with him, the people that were, again, the white captains and the white
Mm-hmm.
slave owners. And so he began to earn all their trust, and he seemed to be really content with his job. And that is when he started hatching the idea to try and plan an escape. He wanted freedom. It was something that he had wanted, he had wanted for some time. And he started discussing this. This is something that I found really interesting. Was he discussed it with all the members, all the slaves that were part of his crew, except for one that he didn't trust. But instead of keeping this plan, real tight-lipped and close to the vest, he
Mm-hmm.
told all of his, um, other slaves that he was on the ship with, and they were all on board. And so, what ends up happening on May 12th, 1862, the CSS Planter gets docked, and the white officers go to spend the night ashore, which is what they tend to do. Is that
Right.
the
Mm-hmm.
slaves would spend the night in the ship, the white officers would spend the night ashore. And one thing that Robert Smalls did um, that night was he asked if the families of the other crewmen could be let aboard. And this was actually not an unusual request. And the white captain said, "Yep, no problem, as long as they're out by out by dusk, or I forget the exact time, but they had to be out
Okay.
by a certain time. The families. So the families go in there. Robert Smalls had told his wife that he was planning an escape, but she didn't know much about it. But
Mm-hmm.
all of the other families, all of the children, all of the other wives of all the other people there were hearing about this for the first time, and they said, "It's gonna happen tonight. We are on our way out." And there was protesting. There was husbands and wives were arguing. This is a suicide mission. This is this is going to get us all killed. Um, but eventually the protests relented and the plan went forward. And so there was a sort of a fake handoff where the it was pretended to walk some of the families out, and then they were able to get back on. And then at 3
Okay.
a.m. that night, the ship took off, and Robert Smalls again is steering the ship, and he's doing it as he's trying to look as cool as possible. I believe the quote I saw was he was trying to look like he was just enjoying the nice morning air,
Mm-hmm.
and he was wearing a captain's hat on. This is where the captain comes in. He was wearing a captain's hat on to try to
Gotcha.
fool anybody that might from the shore might be looking in, so they could see the white hat. Um, at one point, he sails by Fort Sumter, and I'm not exactly sure how this works, but they had somehow requested signals from him. I imagine there's some sort of um, a light signal that you can use from shore to request to a
Right.
boat. Hey, we
I'm
want to. Yeah.
imagining sort of like the air, like airport runway people, how they have like the hand signs with the different light things. That's kind of what I'm
Right.
imagining.
Right. So it's something with a lantern. I'm not going to pretend like I understand that, but at some point, somebody at Fort Sumter, which was a nearby fort, requested that Smalls, like prove that he knew what he was doing. That he was supposed to be there. He gave all the correct signals, and he waited longer than usual. And they were all worried that something was up, but Fort Sumter eventually gave them the A-OK, and they proceeded onward um, until eventually they were out of range of Confederate gunboats. There was one Confederate ship that seemed to recognize what was going on, but they were out of range.
Hmm.
And so the crew pulls down the Confederate flag. They get a white bed sheet and they tie it up and they raise it up high. Keep in mind, this is still the middle of the night. They
Right.
sail over to some Union ships, and the Union ships are ready to fire. Again, middle of the night, not
Hmm.
exactly radar technology. They see a ship sailing towards them. They think it might be a Confederate ship, and this
Right.
was a Confederate ship,
Yeah.
an hour ago. Until eventually they were able to just barely make out that white bed sheet. And one of the quotes from the people that was there, one of the Union officers that was there, says, "As the steamer came near, and under the stern of the Onward, one of the colored men stepped forward and, taking off his hat, shouted, 'Good morning, sir. I have brought you some old United States guns.'" And that man was Robert Smalls. And so we've got again the the joyous Robert Small saying, "I'm bringing back the United States guns. The Confederacy had them
Hmm.
for a short time, and now they are back in the hands of the Union." And he was quite happy to be now a free man serving in the Union. He actually goes and continues serving in the Union Navy and then the Union Army for for most of the rest of the war, and was instrumental in Abe Lincoln um, eventually allowing black people to serve in the Union military. That
Wow.
was something that they were, yeah, that was something they were a little uneasy with. And again, I don't know
Hmm.
the full story itself, but he was really instrumental in convincing Lincoln and Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, to say, "Yep, let's allow that to happen." It kind of only makes sense.
Right. And as we talked about, I believe in episode 2 of, Mike Takes the Wheel, or volume 2, I guess, about Moses Fleetwood Walker,
Pete
that,
Walker.
just because it was the North doesn't mean that people weren't also racist. So it's like,
Yes.
just because they didn't want to own black people doesn't mean that they thought black people were their equal. So
Uh, y-
they were really
exactly.
hesitant to let them, have guns alongside them, Uh, but obviously that was the right decision because I feel like that probably made a big difference in the war.
Well, right. It was the right decision on a moral level, but also just on a strategic level. Like, hey,
Right.
escape slaves.
Obviously,
Like,
yeah.
you get out of there, and you can you'll be able to fight for your freedom instead of
Hmm.
fighting for your oppressors, as Robert Smalls was forced to do for the
Hmm.
first several months of that war. So, sort of a sad story about this. So that is why Robert Smalls becomes famous for the most part, is that he, as a slave, was able to steal a Confederate ship and drive it into Union waters, and that's just kind of one of those stories that you hear and you're like, that's kind of amazing, and it sort of like you were talking before, Gavin. How
Mm.
could people not see that coming? Like, why was
Right.
that allowed to happen? If you're again, the Confederates weren't the brightest people in the world, but still, like, come on.
Right. But also, how like kick ass is it that he's like a pirate, and I love that.
Yeah, it's great. I wasn't aware we were allowed to say kick ass on this podcast, but if this is your podcast, so I'm into
We'll use it sparingly, only
it.
for certain
Only on Mike
exceptional
Takes the
things.
Wheel episodes.
Sure.
This, I think this would definitely count. Sort of a sad story about this, that later in his life, and it's not clear exactly when, he wanted to get a pension for serving in the Navy. Um,
Mm.
and then he found out he wasn't officially commissioned, was the exact line.
That sucks.
He said
That's
that
really dumb.
he, he said that he had gotten the official commission, but then he had lost it. In 1883, a bill had passed a committee to put him on a list, but then the bill got halted. It was just a whole thing. There's allegations in 1883. It was entirely possible that this was simply because he was black, as Reconstruction had ended at that point.
Right.
And then eventually in 1897, an act of Congress, was able to grant him a $30 a month commission, which was the equivalent of a Navy captain. So it took
Okay.
way too long,
And
but
I'm
he was
sure,
able to eventually get his pension.
knowing Congress, it was not retroactive either. So they probably didn't give him the money that he should have gotten that entire time.
I, while I don't know that for sure, I would wager $30 a month on that. Um, so after the war, so Robert Small's story doesn't end when the war ends. Unfortunately, with a lot of these, slave stories, there's a famous story of a slave named Billy from the American Revolution, or Crispus Attucks. We just don't know much about them before or after whatever thing happened that made them
Hmm.
famous. Not the case with Robert Smalls. And in fact,
Oh,
he
okay.
continues to lead an interesting life after the war. And what I think might be even cooler than taking the ship, stealing the
Cooler,
Confederate ship, and
cooler than being a literal pirate.
cooler than that is that after the war, he's a free man. He goes back to South Carolina and buys his former master's house after his former master wasn't paying
Oh,
taxes on it. And he goes and owns that house, which is
oh
just
man.
like in the ultimate fu to everything that had kept him down, and it kept generations of black Americans down. He says, I'm going to own this house now, like it is in a place where he was property 5 years earlier. It's for
Hmm.
me personally, that is just amazing.
Yeah.
He spends about 9 months there learning how to read and write, and he works in a business that helps freemen, recently freed slaves, because this was a problem that had to be dealt with. Like, okay, we have freed the slaves. What do they do
Hmm.
now?
Right.
Um, like that, that was a problem that had to be dealt with in many ways, across the time, and particularly after the Civil War, that became a big problem. So he worked there for a little while, and then eventually he turns his eye towards politics. And in 1868, he gets elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives, and there
Okay.
he introduced a Homestead Act there, and he worked to pass a civil rights bill. And then in 1874, he gets himself elected to the actual real United States House of Representatives. And while he was there, he fought really hard against ending Reconstruction. He wanted to keep those Union
Hmm.
troops in the South. For
Right.
those who don't know, after the Civil War, it wasn't just the Confederacy lost the Civil War and that was it. There was troops stationed in the South, and it was, they were not allowed to vote for president depending on the state, for a number of elections after, to try and really make sure that slavery didn't take hold under a new name, that these freed blacks were really given a shot.
Even though it kind of did, still
Well,
under like
that's
sharecropping.
yeah. Well, that's where we this is kind of where we start to see it, is after uh, in 1874, the Union's getting a little. I shouldn't say the Union. The United States is getting a little. Okay, we've been doing this now for almost a decade. Can we, you know, do we need to keep doing this? And then eventually, in the election of 1876, there's many episodes and YouTube videos on that. But basically, what ends up happening is the election for president. Um, there were a number of problems with it, and basically the deal was, we are going to allow this person to be elected president, Benjamin Harrison, but we are not,
Hmm.
or pardon me, it wasn't Benjamin Harrison. I believe it was Rutherford B. Hayes.
Okay.
We're going to let him be elected president, but we're going to end Reconstruction, pull the troops out of the South, and let the Southern states run themselves. And you can imagine at that point
Yeah.
the uh, the opportunity for black people to be in government went away. His district was sort of gerrymandered out, and he was not able to continue into Congress. Continue in Congress. He was, however, by President Benjamin Harrison, a number of years later, appointed to the collector port of Beaufort, which was, a pretty lucrative job. If you were a port collector, that was a really important job that he was entrusted with.
What
And he
is
lived.
that job? A port
It's
collector?
Yeah, so it's collecting duties on collecting taxes on things that come in, being shipped. Again, think of, the 1800s, shipping
Gotcha. So
things
he
across
was
continents.
he was more or less like a customs agent.
Yeah, it was exactly like a customs agent.
Okay.
My professor, my favorite professor from college, a guy named Andrew Cohen, wrote a book called Contraband, which is all about how smuggling and tax collecting worked during this period of time. Really interesting book.
Interesting.
Really interesting guy. He does that. He lives into, I believe, the 19 teens, 1915, where he dies of malaria and diabetes at the age of 75. And the quote that's at the end of his Wikipedia article that I'll kind of share with everyone here. My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life. And clearly, Robert Smalls, when given any opportunity, when given less of a chance of an
Hmm.
opportunity than many white counterparts, becomes a war hero, becomes a congressman, and you know really becomes kind of this icon of, here is what free blacks can do. And he was famous in the time. His stories spread throughout the North, and he was sort of hailed as a hero. He had a number of opportunities after he stole that ship, uh, that aren't worth getting into because I don't know them quite as well. But he
Hmm.
became famous during this time, and again, all they need is an equal chance in the battle of life. And I think that is sort of a wonderful note for him to kind of leave his mark, um, on. And that is the brief story of Robert Smalls, uh, the coolest person from the Civil War that I'm aware of, that I think needs his story told more.
Absolutely. And I would like to fully co-sign um, on the stance that, like I mentioned earlier, the last week tonight with John Oliver takes, in that they should just replace all the statues, especially in South Carolina, but probably everywhere else too, um, of Confederate soldiers, generals, whatever, with Robert Smalls. Uh, that'd be a much more
Yeah,
fitting, much more heroic person. So, fully co-sign
I
on
I,
on that.
I couldn't agree more. Less Robert E. Lee statues and more statues of pirates that were that were double crossing the Confederacy. I love it.
Absolutely.
So this
So,
has been episode 43. Are we done?
I think so.
Do you want to do the outro, considering this is a Mike Takes the Wheel episode?
Thank you very much for listening. This has been episode 43 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Hopefully, this one actually exports correctly because it's getting rather late, and uh, I'm sure. Well, both
I
of
have a
us have to
lesson to
work
play tomorrow.
tomorrow. Yeah, both of us have to work tomorrow. So hopefully, this one works, and we don't have to re-record it because that would make me pull out my non-existent hair. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. We will be back next week with hopefully a very less kind of rushed and more traditional
Professional.
episode of what even is professionalism anyway, right? Like, anyway, thank you very much for listening. We will you will hear us next week.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.